You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Hello, I'm Tom Buick and welcome to this weekly edition of Skills World Live. And what another eventful week, folks, it's been in the coronavirus universe. Thankfully, more shops and businesses are now open, with consumers having to observe the 2-metre social distancing rule. It's become mandatory to wear face coverings in England on all public transport. Not that the hairdressers or the coiffeurs, if you're listening in France, are allowed to open just yet. Tony, my favourite Turkish barber here in Sussex, is just going to have to wait a little while longer to deal with my overgrown neck hairs. And talking of my studio man cave here in the garden of southern England, we celebrated Sussex Day this week. In case you didn't know it, ladies and gentlemen, there was once a time in the 5th century when the land of the South Saxons was an independent kingdom. There were no FE colleges to speak of back then, of course, but the capital of this beautiful county, then as now, was Chichester. Today, the parliamentary seat of England's apprenticeships and skills minister. Talking of regal ambitions, Her Majesty's loyal Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Education, Gillian Keegan MP, will be making her 4th appearance on Skills World Live next week to discuss the adult skills and social justice agenda. Indeed, the whole issue of how people can access the life chances and opportunities to progress has come into very sharp focus of late, as a number of world events have combined with the pandemic to create unprecedented scenes and demonstrations on both sides of the Atlantic. The tragic killing of George Floyd at the hands of police brutality in Minneapolis, and another shooting of a black man running away from police in Atlanta only last weekend, has led to some serious soul-searching in America and, of course, here in Europe. Campaigners have taken to the streets to protest at the institutional racism in our societies. Protest groups like Black Lives Matter have organised street campaigns, resulting in the statues of slave traders like Edward Colston in the port city of Bristol being torn down and tossed into the harbour. There's been wider calls for others caught up in Britain's colonial past to have their public memorials removed as well. It led to the governors of Oxford's Oriel College this week to vote in favour of having a statue of Cecil Rhodes removed. Rhodes played a key role in the expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century southern Africa, including in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia. Critics accuse these campaigns of trying to rewrite history, while protesters for the statue's removal say they are a symbol of imperialism and racism and have to go. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson responded this week by saying his government would set up a commission to make policy recommendations on what can be done. His announcement was made not longer after the release of the government's latest Social Mobility Commission report. The commission, which has been in place since 2013, has audited Whitehall government departments on the progress they've made against a whole stack of recommendations, from health to housing to education, skills and employment. Disappointedly, the report found that over the last 7 years, little or no action was taken on a third of the recommendations. Some progress was made on about half the recommendations, with strong progress made on about a quarter of the Commission's recommendations since 2013. The sort of policies that have still not been implemented include things like increasing the funding available for Level 2 and Level 3 qualifications to help disadvantaged people compete for decent jobs, and the introduction of a student premium in FE, modelled on the successful pupil premium in schools. It led this week to the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy MP, to accuse the government's latest racism inquiry as written on the back of a fag packet and a distraction away from the inaction on the part of successive governments. The Tottenham MP, son of Guyanese parents, and a former education minister went further, reading off a whole load of other reports and recommendations that had still not been actioned by the government. It's why on the show this evening we'll be asking, has the cause of social mobility been put back by a generation as a result of these recent world events? And why is it that Whitehall appears to be such a laggard when it comes to implementing the policies that ordinary citizens, black and white, rich and poor, men and women, have so often called for? You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. On tonight's programme, we'll be kicking off the debate with our special guest, Stephen Cooper, the CEO of a private banking group. Mr. Cooper is one of the government's social mobility commissioners. I'll be asking him about the report and what it now means in light of current events. In the phone chat sections of the programme, we'll be analysing the issues still further by talking to a professor of social mobility at Exeter University, Lee Elliott Major, and Cindy Rampersaud, Senior Vice President of the awarding body giant, Pearson. In the second half of this extended programme, we will be talking to Helen Barnard of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Palvinder Singh, the Group Deputy Principal at Kidderminster College. Do stay with us though, folks, for a very special hashtag Stand Up for Skills segment this week. After handing the mic over to my co-presenter, Kirsty Donnelly, CEO of City and Guilds Group, Kirsty will be passing the mic on to one of her trustees, Frank Douglas. Mr. Douglas is an eminent voice on race diversity, inclusion and culture, as well as a seasoned HR professional who has worked in a number of multinational companies. I'm sure you'd all agree the show's editor, Gavin O'Mara, has done another brilliant job of bringing some really fantastic guests together. But first, let's find out what's been making the news headlines in your skills world this week. The Association of Colleges has called for the government in England to find an additional £3.6 billion to invest in education and training for up to 764,000 people, it says, are most at risk as a result of the pandemic. The AOC's Skills Recovery Plan sets out 5 key asks of ministers, including one-off monies to support a national tutoring and catch-up scheme, traineeship programmes of up to 12 months to ensure young people get work simulation as a prerequisite for joining the labour market. On improvements to adult education, the AOC calls for an integrated budget of £1.4 billion, bringing together 3 current government schemes: the National Skills Fund, the National Retraining Scheme and the Shared Prosperity Fund. In other news, the Universities Minister, Michelle Donnellan, has announced £3 million to support student mental health in England and Wales. The initiative, called Student Space, aims to close the gap in higher education support services by enabling all students, wherever they are studying, to access a range of preventive and therapeutic interventions, working alongside existing welfare services. And finally, the Department for Education has announced a COVID Summer Food Fund, which will be a one-off scheme in response to the unique circumstances many families face during these difficult times. The government says the fund is a one-off intervention that will support those already eligible to receive free school meals. The decision comes following a U-turn by the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, whose department had originally said parents would not get the much-needed financial support over the summer. However, following the campaigning efforts of Premiership and England footballer Marcus Rashford and the Conservative chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, changed tack and announced the continuation of the scheme. That's all your Skills World News from fenews.co.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Buick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111. That tune is called Bad Blood, and the artists Vivera and Anya Gold. Regular listeners to this show, of course, will know by now that we don't yet have a license to play top 40 chart toppers, unfortunately. So we've actively taken the decision to support independent music artists instead. All available for your listening pleasure over at epidemicsound.com. If any of those tracks do take your fancy, let us know. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. I might even do a little shout out for you if you ask me nicely. Now, tonight's big debate is asking whether the cause of social mobility has been put back by a generation because of recent world events. It comes at a time when a major recent report from the government's Social Mobility Commission has found, during its latest audit of Whitehall departments, just how far they have got in terms of implementing recommendations that would help boost life chances for everyone. The results are disappointing. Only a quarter of the recommendations have been fully implemented after 7 years of the Commission's existence. Joining me on the line now to discuss the report and the future of social mobility in the United Kingdom is Stephen Cooper, one of the commissioners, and also currently the Joint Acting Chair. Good evening, Stephen.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining us. Now, can I just get sort of straight to the heart of the matter by asking you why you think Whitehall has failed to implement nearly a third of your Commission's recommendations?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, there has been some progress, but clearly a lot more needs to be done. I think there's a number of reasons. I think that there's a lot of initiatives that have taken place, but very few of those have stayed the course. So things have chopped and changed, and therefore you get less impact through time. But our main view is that, unlike with race and with gender, there is no policy to really, with all major spending initiatives, to review what is the impact of that spend on social mobility. So all the major sort of investments on infrastructure across the UK do not have to have a formalised positive impact on social mobility, or at least that is not seen coordinated through government. And I guess the best example I saw of that as a commissioner was in Oldham. And in Oldham, there isn't any sort of scale employer. It's lots of SMEs. And the SMEs have done a really good job with local FE colleges at being clear with them what the skills they need. And the FE colleges have put courses in place to provide those skills. That's great. And it's really positive when you see a lot of that activity. You would expect that would therefore attract teachers to that area. But one of the major issues in Oldham is housing and the quality of that housing. Something like 25% of people who rent property in Oldham change that property every 6 months. The quality is not where it needs to be. But that's not within the gift of the local authorities. So you've got a combination of local initiatives that need to be more joined up with central government departments, and then it's that joined up coordination that we think is the biggest impediment to making more progress.
As you say, the lack of social mobility, and I think there's a general consensus that it's stalled in recent years, and I think there's data in your report that underpins that. It is a complex problem. Alas, there aren't magic bullet solutions, whether they're frankly in the public or in the private sector, and this quest to join up public policy has been kind of there for a very, very long time indeed. But look, it won't surprise you that a programme like Skills World Live, we want to particularly focus on just two chapters in your report, particularly the ones on education and employment prospects. In education, your report noted that there has been strong progress made in around 7, I think, of the 18 different issues the Commission had already identified. For example, 49% of disadvantaged pupils, that's nearly half, still don't reach the required standards in English and maths by the end of primary school, compared to 71% for all other pupils. Why is that, do you think? Why are we making such slow progress at the end of primary school for so many pupils?
Well, I think it's a combination of reasons, and there have been some improvements, but to your point, at the age of 16, only a quarter of sort of students from disadvantaged backgrounds get a good pass in English and maths, compared to half of all other students. So the disadvantaged element is struggling, and you just see that in today's world, whereby a large amount of children from disadvantaged backgrounds have no access to a device. So they're not receiving an online education at the moment, compared to a higher percentage of children from more advantaged backgrounds. I think it also stems from early years, where the teachers in early years, half of those are on some kind of income support. They're not given the the wage or the prestige that they should deserve. And I think that stems all the way through. Similarly, once you get into further education, there isn't enough support put around disadvantaged students, which might be, devices, it might be space and time to learn. Often sort of their own accommodation doesn't allow for that. And there is no premium applied to help students in those areas. Also, if you look at the more sort of what we call cold spots for social mobility, often more rural or remote areas, they can't get to places of education very easily. There aren't enough bus routes, or the buses aren't frequent enough, which again just highlights why you need that joined up approach.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, the challenges are multifaceted, aren't they? And they're complex. Let's look at 16 to 19 education then. I mean, the report references the fact that funding in FE in England is still 7% down in real terms on where it was in 2010, despite the injection of £400 million into the student base rate more recently. I mean, you've made what seems on the face of it a very common sense proposal to simply extend, I think you referenced it there as well, but the concept of the pupil premium in schools, which has been very successful, hasn't it, in helping uplift disadvantaged pupils. Why is it, do you think, the government just hasn't simply rolled that forward and made that a reality for the 16 to 19-year-olds studying in our FE system?
Well, we've had no response to that. And to your point, the premium has worked elsewhere. Yeah. And there's no reason why it wouldn't work here. And the real sort of impact on spending in 16 to 19 is that there's been a bigger impact there, a bigger cut there in recent years than anywhere else. And we want that to be reversed.
Yeah. Do you sense, on balance, is it a lack of the will to want to spend the public money? Is it a lack of know-how in terms of how to actually get around, as we've been discussing, these multi-dimensional, multi-complex problems across communities, across the public and private sector, across education, housing, health? It's just not how government, never mind in Whitehall, but government generally is structured, is it? I mean, you're obviously a business person. You've got a background in business. You're used to as well, probably dealing with organisational silos. I mean, there's nothing particularly new about that. But as a business person, I mean, would you go about delivering some of the government policies in the way that Whitehall and other parts of government decides to do? I mean, have you got any thoughts there that you could share about how it could be improved, apart from the obvious point about how we just join up more?
Yeah, I think I'm no expert on Whitehall or how government works, but from where I see it, what you see is some good stuff that happens, but it's kind of like siloed. So that in our report, there has been some good stuff done. Maybe it's not being applied consistently. You have to ask if there are learns. We've already mentioned one around the student premium for secondary education. Why has that not been applied to 16 to 19-year-olds? Because it's clearly worked, and there's no reason why it wouldn't work, as far as I can see, for further education. But what seems to me, running a business, you would say, okay, so some good stuff is happening, sort of going down. What can you do consistently to cut through all of those things? So a consistent lens on social mobility across housing, across education, across all these various government departments, so that any spend is applied to also what is the impact of this on social mobility. And I think that's the thing that is missing. Yeah. If you run a business, you'd have that constant lens. Yeah,
and as you know, I mean, in business, you tend to obviously look at the inputs that's going into a process, into some activity, but you're also always looking at the outcomes as well, because it's the outcomes, obviously, in business that ultimately drive the bottom line and drive your profits. But you don't always see those kind of behaviours, do you, in the public sector?
It's the outcomes that get measured.
Yeah,
and the lack of a measurement around this consistently, I think, doesn't help.
Yeah, indeed. Finally, Stephen, I mean, given recent world events and the impact that's obviously now having on the whole politics of class, gender, and of course racial equality, what do you expect to see your Social Mobility Commission focus on next? I mean, I'm curious as to what you think. For example, the Prime Minister's new commission, which was hastily announced earlier this week, how will that, for example, interact with your government commission or government-backed commission?
Yeah, so as a commission, we're thinking hard about what are the things we want to look at going forward. We've got some interesting stats and viewpoints coming out on apprenticeships, for example, for next week. We're looking hard at how we think COVID and racial and social tension that we're seeing at the moment will have an impact going forward. It's well covered, but those who will suffer most are the poorest and the most disadvantaged. I was speaking to a school in North London last week, and about how we might get some of the children from disadvantaged backgrounds back into school as soon as possible. Those teachers are working hard. In this particular school, those teachers have not had a day off since the end of March, looking after children of key workers.
Indeed.
Many of those teachers are from a BAME background, which may be more vulnerable to COVID. Many of their students, and they're reaching out to them by phone because they don't have access to a device or don't have access to data. Mm-hmm. And what you often see in schooling is a September dip post the summer holidays. That's going to be dramatically bigger this time round, particularly for those in a disadvantaged background. And work needs to be done to really level that up as quickly as possible. But that's the opportunity. That's the opportunity now through this crisis, which is how can you turbocharge the levelling up that the government have committed to doing so, and we want to play a part in that. Okay,
well, to echo that old mantra about don't waste a good crisis, let's hope that actually these sorts of challenges are finally addressed, and that the next time when you do your audit report, a lot more of your recommendations, of course, have been implemented by public policy makers. Stephen Cooper, Joint Chair of the Government Social Mobility Commission. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
I was knocked down, heard the countdown through the haze, in the face of defeat, yeah. I was ruled out with no bailout, on my own, all alone, left to bleed out. But I rose up from the ground, just like I was spellbound. All the odds were against me, so I picked up the pace, and now I'm in the race. Give me some space. I'm a movement and I ain't losing. Gonna go, 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 go. Like a bullet, won't take no bullshit. You should know, no. I'm about to explode. So I've been told that I should fold and give in. I can't win in this game, no. But you can hear me laughing. I'm the new thing in this field. You should kneel instead of me now. Yeah, I rose up from the dead. Your words inside my head. All the odds were against me. But now I'll lead ahead with grace. I'm winning this race. Give me some space. I'm a movement and I ain't losing. Gonna go, 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 go. Like a bullet, don't take no bullshit. You should know, no. I'm about to explode. I ain't asking for permission, no. I don't have to say I'm sorry. I ain't staying in the background, no. 'Cause I don't need your worry. I'm a movement and I ain't losing. Gonna go, 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 go. Like a bullet, won't take no bullshit. You should know, no. I'm about to explode.
About to explode. That's Daxton with Aston Tur. Now to continue tonight's big debate, looking at whether or not social mobility has been set back by a generation because of recent world events. I'm delighted to be joined on the line now by Professor Lee Elliott-Major, who's a Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. Good evening, Lee.
Good evening.
And joining us in this three-way segment is Cindy Rampersaud, who's Senior Vice President, Pearson BTEC and Apprenticeship. Good evening, Cindy.
Hi, Tom. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, always great to get you back on the show. Now, Lee, let's come to you first. You're a professor of social mobility, no less. You understand, therefore, the complex nature of structural inequalities in our society. But is that complexity a good enough excuse for why Whitehall appears to be making such limited progress on a whole load of different areas that would give the next generation the hope, at least, that they could be better off than their parents?
Wow, that's a big question.
It is. Are they moving fast enough?
I think, the thing that social mobility studies show us is that it's driven by two things, and that is educational inequality and social or economic inequality. So gaps that widen within the classroom, the college or school, and those that widen in the workplace or in the home environment. And what we've got at the moment, I'm afraid to say, is a toxic mix of both widening educational inequalities, and you've seen lots of surveys indicating this, so that those, from more privileged backgrounds are getting lots of tutoring, lots of support, living in big houses. I mean, I caricature, of course, but it's on average quite true. And that those children who can be equally as talented, by the way, but won't have the internet, will be in cramped conditions and will just not have had so much support. So the achievement gap, I'm afraid to say, is probably going to widen over this period, and that has lifetime consequences for those children potentially. At the same time, we have many parents and carers who have been furloughed, who will be losing their jobs, and at the same time, the middle classes have actually gaining more money, so because they're not going on these holidays, they're not going to expensive restaurants. So actually, if you're in a job and you're working, if you're able to work at home, you're probably actually saving more money. So in short, I think we're going to see both widening economic and educational inequality, which is bad news for social mobility.
It is, and indeed that achievement gap you referred to, I mean, even pre-COVID, it was around about 16 months behind for disadvantaged pupils compared to their wealthier peers at the end of the sort of primary school phase, and it grows to about 18 months, I think, by the end of the secondary phase. So as you say, I mean, the danger is that gap's going to get even wider. Now, Cindy, like so many of us, I'm sure you've probably been watching in horror how recent world events have unfolded. I mean, why is it, do you think, that in so many societies, including here in Britain, despite the advances of the civil rights movement, we're still talking about institutional racism or racism in general right now here in the 21st century?
I think the focus has been, I don't think we've had a razor-sharp focus on it, to be honest, Tom. I think what happens is we talk about it for a while, but what happens is actions aren't put in place. But I also think it's about education, it's about understanding, and it's interesting that Lee talks about education, but actually education also helps people understand each other and respect each other, and I think it's complex, but I think education has a really important role to play, but as does accountability. So, we've set targets, but actually what's the accountability behind those targets? I mean, David Lammy said yesterday, didn't he? It's like we keep developing one action plan and one commission after another, but actually we just got to kind of get on and do it. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was the impact of COVID, not just on broadly on mobility, and I think, just to Lee's point, but the group that are most affected will be those that are socially, where the social demography, where they're the most disadvantaged. And we know that already, that there isn't an equal playing field. Actually, those young people are more likely to be not attain at school, make choices about not going to university, not enter the job market, And actually, if you're not, we know, don't we, from evidence, that if you're not in the job market by the time you're 24, that's going to stay with you forever. But actually, if we bring it back to the BAME discussion, we also know that COVID hasn't been indiscriminate, but the BAME community have been more affected by it disproportionately, partly because of the jobs that they're in. So, care workers, bus drivers, the kind of cleaners in hospitals and the like. And again, they are more likely coming out of this to be socially disadvantaged because, again, it's also that same group as the kind of broad white working class that we might talk about, who may not have the access to the infrastructure around technology, that may not be getting the learning, and so you kind of get the gap happening around education attainment. But the real worry is that gap's going to widen, as Lee has said, and remain with many of those young people as they go forward. But I think back to your point on the kind of race issue, I think that there needs to be action and there needs to be accountability, and education, I think, has a really crucial role to play in terms of understanding the history and actually understanding the history of why Black people came here.
But when
they in the 40s, 50s to as part of kind of rebuilding Britain, actually many second, third generation where this is their home. But I think this systemic racism within the education system is also something that we kind of need to address, both in terms of design of curriculum, but sometimes bias, and just kind of challenge that.
And when we talk about both challenging that, but also you mentioned there what practical actions we can take as a society to actually combat, whether it's unbiased racism or whatever form it comes from. As we know, after the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, it did lead to at least some of these more positive action type programs. We saw it also with the dismantling of apartheid, obviously a different context there in South Africa, but nevertheless, this notion of sort of positive discrimination. Lee, you'll know as a professor of social policy, this whole kind of concept of positive discrimination has got a kind of mixed history, hasn't it? Both in terms of its success and how it's received by other people in society. But do you think, have we reached a stage where, I think as Cindy was alluding to there, and also what David Lammy said the other day, that there's no amount of a shortage of analysis of where all the challenges are, what all the problems are, and they are complex. But there doesn't seem to be that sort of sense either of urgency sometimes around these debates, or importantly, the actions get followed through and we kind of make the progress we need to make. Lee?
Yeah, I prefer, there's many terms for this. I suppose I do prefer the term levelling up, not making the political point, but, when I give talks to teachers and pupils and parents, sometimes, I put this image up, this stark image up of a playing field, a football field, right? And it's you could imagine it's a steep angle. And the reason I put it up, it's quite a stark image, is that I say, and I believe, and I've looked at this for so many years, we don't live in an equal playing field, right? Life is deeply unequal.
Yeah.
And so I have become more radical, to be honest, the more evidence I've seen over the years. Yeah. And I think there is lots of unconscious, unintentional, often bias towards poorer children, towards Black children. I think that personally I would have lower offers, for example, for going to university. I'm not... I totally understand the argument that says you shouldn't send someone to university if they're not able to survive and prosper, in that environment. But all the studies suggest that, it's honestly, I feel like it's a rigged race, the academic system, because, the young people I was talking about earlier who aren't able to get all that extra private tutoring for their A-levels or GCSEs, the amount of money and resource that goes into them getting the A grades, and because it's a zero-sum game, it's very hard, actually, and I think it's become harder if you're from a normal background, actually, as well as a poor background, to compete. is a very unequal place. So I prefer to call these policies a sort of levelling up, positive discrimination that sort of has a sense that it's unfair in some ways in some circles to me. But I actually think we need to be more radical.
Sure.
Can I just jump in?
Please do,
I
Cindy.
agree.
What's your reflections on that?
Yeah, I agree actually, but I also think on the issue of BAME, even if members or young people from the BAME community have had access to that tutoring or had access to the kind of support or have the infrastructure, they're still less likely to get the opportunity. So some of this is, and I'm always a bit careful about having to say we're going to dilute stuff or we're going to make it easy, because actually many from the BAME community, what they want is equality and fairness. What they don't want is special treatment or for it to be condescending, because actually in the long run, I think that can cause problems.
Sure.
So I think we kind of need to get to the root cause, which is actually how do we make sure that the education system is enabling them to attain equally, and so that actually when they get to the point of looking at university or looking at work, that actually it is a level playing field, and education can play a really crucial role in that. But I do also agree that I've shifted on the view of targets, not so much positive discrimination, but actually, if you're an organisation, and in London and you only have 1% of your workforce that is BAME, that you clearly have to kind of look around at the kind of population or the customers that you're serving and just say, is that representative? Because actually, it's probably not very smart for your business if you can't represent your consumers and your customers. Yeah. So I think it's more about, being clear about what it is we need to fix, maybe thinking about targets and accountability.
Okay.
I'm really careful about diluting and saying people are less able or young people are less able.
Yeah.
But I understand as well what Lee is saying, which is at a point in time that we're at now, they may not have benefited from an education system that allows equality.
Yeah, alas, we've only got 20 seconds left, unfortunately, of this segment. But can I just ask you both in closing, just for a sentence or two, about if there was one policy that you would want the government to prioritise around social mobility. It might be, for example, more affordable housing, for example. But if there's just one policy that really the government should be prioritising as part of this levelling up agenda, Lee, in a sentence and a half or so, what would it be for you?
So I'm a passionate educationalist, as you know, but the one policy I would recommend would be a wealth tax, that we would tax the very wealthy, and that would be used for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Okay, wealth tax as opposed to more income tax, interestingly. On that one. Yeah, I think there's huge wealth in this country, and I think it's time that we use that to the benefit of all the people. Cindy, final word to you then.
I think it would be looking at the curriculum and making sure that the curriculum is representative. And the other thing I'd look at, is actually the technology infrastructure and making sure young people had access to it, because that will be a key enabler for learning. Okay, Cindy Rampersad, Senior Vice President, Pearson BTEC and Apprenticeships, Professor Lee Elliott Major, Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. Thanks so much both for joining Skills World Live this evening. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
Posting pictures on the gram so other people know that we're more than friends. And ever since you came around, I've never been sober, always in my head. Met you at a time when I was so low. Went from just talking to taking you home. I don't wanna go back to who I used to be. So if you ever leave me, promise you won't let me down.
love was just like in the movies, with a happy end. Yeah, but sometimes you can't handle your emotions, and I guess that's okay. Met you at a time when I was so low, went from just talking to taking you home. I don't wanna go back to who I used to be, so if you ever leave me, promise you won't let me drown. Promise you won't let me drown. Promise you won't let me drown. Yeah. Oh, let me drown. No. Met you at a time when I was so low. Went from just talking to taking you home. I don't wanna go back to who I used to be. So if you ever leave me, promise you won't let me drown. Won't let me drown. Promise you won't let me drown. Won't let me drown. Don't let me drown. Don't let me drown. Promise you won't let me drown.
Let Me Drown. That's Deans with Andy De Los Santos. Another great track there from epidemicsound.com. And do stay with us, by the way, because we've still got our weekly hashtag Stand Up for Skills segment to come, led, of course, by Kirsty Donnelly. But to continue tonight's big debate discussion on social mobility, delighted to be joined by Helen Barnard, who's the acting director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Good evening, Helen.
Good evening.
And Palvinder Singh, Group Deputy Principal, Finance Planning and Business Curriculum Development, Kidderminster College. That's a brilliant job title, Palvinder, and a long one. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Tom.
Yeah, great to have you both on. And as you've probably gathered, if you had any chance to listen to the debate so far this evening, it's been a really, really good discussion. Now, let's begin with you, Helen. Your foundation has probably done more over the decades to influence the debate on social policy, perhaps more than any other. But what is clear about the government's social mobility audit report published recently is that more kids are in poverty, investment in 16 to 19-year-olds has gone down, and certainly relative to schools and HE. And while there's been some progress, it's important to highlight that in terms of closing the attainment gap at GCSE and A-level, we're still talking about an educational model that often works against disadvantaged and some ethnic groups. I mean, to what extent, Helen, are any of these wicked problems easily sorted by legislation and government policy? Are there things the government's not doing that it really should be doing?
So I think they are, I wouldn't say easily, but they are definitely solvable.
Solvable, yeah.
And I think one of the things reading the social mobility audit report is that I think one of the messages I took from it was that just focusing on the education bit isn't by itself going to unlock all the opportunities that our young people should have. So I thought it was really striking that one of the things it kind of focuses on is saying, look, we've got more children being pulled into poverty with all the pressure that puts on family life. We've also got, once you get out the other end of education, even if your skills have gone up, we've got too many people stuck in low-paid jobs where it's insecure, you can't get more training to progress. And we've also got something like housing. It's really interesting to see in a social mobility report where we're used to having the very laser focus on education, actually saying, hang on, being able to get a secure, affordable home is something that's like a basis for everything else. And yet we've got more and more people who are locked out of that because they're stuck in the private rented sector because you can't get enough social homes. It's expensive. It eats away at your wages.
Yeah.
And I think one thing...
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, as you say, it is about, fundamentally, isn't it, a decent home and a decent job, but also it's about having access to assets. I mean, the things that often sort of amazes me by some of these big social policy debates, and I understand where they come from. It's about ensuring, there's income transfers and redistribution of wealth and tax. But there's often very little conversation about the fact that a lot of disadvantaged people and disadvantaged households just don't have the same access to assets, to pension funds, to, they don't own the bricks and mortar, or they're not paying towards owning the bricks and mortar that they're in. I mean, do you think there are just some fundamentals like that if we got better at that as a society, perhaps some of these concerns about stalling social mobility would go away then, Helen?
I think there is definitely something about if you're growing up in a family for which every day is a struggle just to keep your head above water. I mean, we've just seen some new work of what's been happening for families with kids through this pandemic. And we found when you look at families who were on kind of low-income benefits, universal credit and that, the vast majority have not only had to cut back on essentials like food, they're also getting into debt because they simply can't cover everything. So I think that sense, and talking to a lot of parents, if you're running and running just to try and keep the roof over your head and food on the table, and actually your work isn't doing enough to let you do that, creating the space then for everything else that, you would want to do with your family, with your kids, is incredibly hard. So it's kind of that sense of all these pressures bearing down on families, and that squeezes out the opportunities which, all of us would want every single child to have in our society.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The French sociologist talked about in his book Capital about how wealth begets wealth. Well, we're in a sort of phase, both pre-COVID and now, where effectively job insecurity begets job insecurity, and so many people, so many households, they get sort of trapped, don't they, almost in that downward spiral. Palvinder, I mean, you're a senior leader within a college and the sector, of course, more broadly. I mean, presumably you welcome the Association of Colleges Skills Recovery Plan paper that was published today and the call in it for billions of pounds of additional investment to sort of tackle inequality, but also the fallout from COVID-19.
Absolutely. I think it's a great piece of work, but it's nothing that we wouldn't predict, that we would ask for. I think as a sector, we recognise that we are a solution to a lot of the inequalities within our society, and it's just good to see that we're starting to get recognised for that. I think it's a bit late in the day, but it's good to be recognised for it. But also, with regards to this social mobility report, I was reflecting on it when I was reading it today and thinking, in one way, it's quite devastating and quite quite stark. But in another way, it's quite good because it's quite honest. Yeah, and I think being honest, you can work with that. However, it's if you were to ask anyone, Helen, and anyone else, we could probably predict what the report was going to be before it was released.
Yeah, exactly. It just puts all the data around it for you, doesn't it? It's the way I read it.
Because we've not talked about austerity and the impact of austerity. Yeah. We've not talked about the changing economy and the rapid change of the economy in the last 10 years. The fourth industrial revolution. There are things that are happening so quick, we're not keeping up to pace with it. And when you take out 45% of our FE budget, especially with the adult side, it's obviously going to have an impact. And it's not that people are not trying, because there are people, as previous callers have said, teachers, charity workers, there are so many people out there trying to do and reduce this social mobility gap, but it's still, the pace is wider and faster than what we can keep up with. And it's because we just not got this, we haven't got the resources.
Indeed. Now, talking about pace then, because I thought Cindy made a really important point in the previous segment about, we haven't perhaps had the follow through with accountability, with action. I mean, it's great we're now having this debate as a society about race and racism and about structural inequality more broadly. But she was making the point about, we need more follow through around these things. We can't just keep on, showing the horrendous diversity stats of, senior high court judges, or frankly even, the number of BAME principals in our FE system. I mean, how do you feel about that whole agenda?
It is a problem with that within our society. I've worked in colleges where 30% of our students are BAME, and management, and especially the curriculum management side, was not, wasn't reflective. The governance wasn't reflective. The senior leadership wasn't reflective. And it's we're very good as a sector to manage to monitor the outputs of student progress. But when we start looking at the connectivity between our locality and our students that we've got, and actually looking at those bits about unconscious bias, and particularly with Black Lives Matter now, being so clearly in our minds, and talking about privilege and talking about white privilege. Cindy or the previous professor made reference to inequalities in society. There's that YouTube video that was going around a couple of years ago, which had those students lined up on a line, and it was a $100 race. I don't know if you recall it. If you don't, Google it. It was an excellent depiction of the classroom, because every student is at a different starting point, and the connection between the Black Lives Matter and poverty and inequalities within our society. We all feel the same. We all feel that it's not right, but we're all kind of feeling, what do we do about it, and where do we start with it? And my advice is very simple. We start with it. We start by challenging simple stereotypes and our unconscious bias. And, so if we haven't got the role models within our own colleges for our students to look up to, then we're not really doing the best job, are we?
No, we're not. And Helen, I mean, on Parvinder's point there about challenging caricatures and stereotypes, I mean, you'll probably be aware of the recent debate about Little Britain and Fawlty Towers, and taking some of these programmes off the airwaves. I mean, do you think that is also, it's often called sometimes the culture wars, but is that increasingly now a dimension of this debate in social policy when you're talking about tackling inequalities? Yes, it's about redistribution, tax, income transfers, all those things that have always been a feature of the discipline. But increasingly, you're seeing this what's described as the culture war dimension entering the debate, aren't you? Whether that's helpful or not.
I think we are. I think sometimes it's helpful in that these things sometimes do real damage. But I think sometimes they distract us from some of the more, concrete things. So, for instance, you're right, it's not just about legislation and so on. There's a massive piece of this which is about the labour market and employers. And thinking about, because I think obviously there's a lot still problems in education, but actually young people from a lot of BAME backgrounds do incredibly well in education, and then they get out into the labour market and find they're stuck in low-paying jobs. And there's been some very solid research showing just how many more CVs you have to send in to get a job and to get an interview if your name is one that people will think doesn't sound British. And it's a really basic thing. And that kind of insight, that needs to come into things like when we get into our recovery from this, which economic recovery will come, what kind of jobs are we going to be getting people back into? And so what we need is to make sure that not just the skills system, but also the employment support system, that they're connected up, that we're thinking we need to get people back into not just any job, but a good job that will give you a chance at a career path. And you need to link up your local skills, your local employment support, and the local economic recovery plan, and make sure that people, we've gone into this pandemic with massive inequalities. I think probably it will have increased them. We need to make sure we use the recovery to actually redesign the systems that are holding people back. And that means employers doing things differently. It means skills providers doing things differently, and as well as the government. But it's been a tragedy, but coming out of it could be an opportunity. We don't just want to rebuild the same things which have been holding people back for the last decade.
So let's try and end this segment then on a positive note, because I think, throughout this discussion, I've obviously been very critical of the government, very critical of where they've got to on some of these key indices of social mobility. But again, to be fair to them, and actually reading the report today, I did feel quite proud to live in a country where actually the government of the day was prepared to commission a group of people who, frankly, are disagreeing with them in terms of what they're doing. So, I think as a democracy, we should be thankful at least for that. But that doesn't take away one iota, still the scale of the challenge ahead, not least with dealing now with the pandemic, which is rapidly moving from being a sort of public health emergency. We're still dealing with that aspect of it, but increasingly it's becoming an economic and social emergency as well. I mean, finally, just the last sort of 30 seconds or so, Palvinder then, just as I asked our previous guest, thinking about an opportunity going forward, what's the one thing you would like to see put in place? And Helen, I'll ask you the same question in a moment.
Yeah, obviously, I'm going to say more investment in FE, because sure. I think FE will deliver for the skills need of this country, and stop wasting money on initiatives which will take years and years and generations to embed in. And we've got a good system here. We've got a good FE system in this country, and we need to resource it to let it do what it does best. Yeah. And it's been doing it up and down in towns and cities for the best part of 150 years.
Indeed. In many ways, it's one of the most resilient parts of the whole post-compulsory education system. Helen, last word to you.
So I think the key thing is the recovery has got to be a good jobs recovery, and levelling up needs to mean investing in skills that get you into a good job, and not just in trains and shiny new infrastructure.
Okay, brilliant insights from both of you, Helen Barnard and Palvinder Singh from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Kidderminster College, respectively. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your time and thoughts with us this evening. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
That funky number was They Called Her Cinnamon by Lionel Quick. It's one of our digital producer, Helly Hanson's favourite tracks. I just hope she was listening in tonight for that. Now, I've been thinking all day about what kind of segue I should do for our regular hashtag Stand Up for Skills part of the show, led, of course, by that City and Guilds Group Supremo, Kirsty Donnelly. Do I make some reference to cinnamon, I thought, the subject of our previous track? Or better still, why don't I just behave like any other grown-up community radio DJ would and simply hand over the mic to my wonderful co-presenter colleague. Kirsty, from the studio, hello, and over to you.
Hey, Tom, it sounds like you finally ran out then of those strap lines. Yeah, they've gone.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks for handing over the mic. Well, listen, hello, everybody. And yes, it's me again, Kirsty from City and Guilds with my weekly hashtag Stand Up for Skills segment. But having now wrestled the mic away from Tom, as I do each week, I'm actually going to be doing something very different this evening and handing it over to a very special guest who it's an enormous privilege to have with us tonight on our slot, Frank Douglas. Tonight, and in light of the atrocious, unnecessary murder of George Floyd in the US, we've decided to focus this Stand Up for Skills segment on standing up for Black Lives Matter movement, specifically linked to our theme tonight, which is why Black careers matter in this Stand Up for Skills segment. When we consider how people from BAME backgrounds are already twice as likely as a white person to suffer unemployment, and that is expected to grow significantly as we see the unemployment levels shoot up in the UK. Not only does this further create disparity, leading to even greater levels of the issues of social mobility in BAME groups, as we've been talking earlier this evening, such potential loss and waste of talent, let alone a loss to the contribution to our collective productivity. And as we heard earlier from one of Tom's guests, Stephen, we have to work much harder to do this levelling up and close the inequality gap. As Stephen said, it needs to be right now and be turbocharged. Just to put this inequality into context, a recent report found that even before COVID-19, unemployment was higher and rising among BAME groups rather than whites, almost double. And I was dismayed when we had the last round of apprenticeship data for England that showed of all apprentices on the apprenticeship programmes, 87% are white, meaning only 13% are from BAME groups. This is simply not good enough. As educators, as policymakers, as employers, we simply have to do more. So I thought it was more appropriate this week for this segment not to be led by me, but by someone with much deeper personal insights into the challenges and blockers that people of colour might be facing in the world of work, education and skills. Frank was born in Jackson, Mississippi, which was and still is the poorest state in America, and historically the hotbed of the Ku Klux Klan. And he was raised in the South Bronx of New York City, a place, of course, known for violence and gang activity. Frank then moved much later to the UK and became the first black male group HR director of a FTSE company, as well as being the first black trustee of the CIPD. I'm also very privileged to say Frank is currently a trustee of City and Guilds too. Frank is also now the CEO of a consulting firm, Curus, that works with companies such as Warner Music, the BBC, Viacom, CBS, Pfizer and Bloomberg, to name but a few, on culture and inclusion. As a passionate champion of diversity, he brings a unique perspective as a Black American in the UK and one of the few to rise to the executive board position in the FTSE. Frank is now going to speak for exactly 7 minutes and 46 seconds, which is the now known exact amount of time, revised today, that the police officer knelt on George Floyd's neck. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I won't start the clock yet because I just want to thank you for allowing me to have this slot. As I say to people, whoever asks me to speak, it's caveat emptor. And so it will be tonight because I may not address exactly the issues you spoke to. But as I was thinking about this, I realized, what can I say? I basically have one day to prepare. And I thought I would humbly talk about myself and go back some on the ground you've mentioned. And I have two asks of the audience. It's not going to be about government funding or level twos. It's going to be about you. So this is a conversation between you and me for 7 minutes and 46 seconds. And I will start the clock. At this point, the knee went on George Floyd's neck. As Christy stated, I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, the most segregated part of the world when my father was growing up there, who grew up picking cotton. He had colored-only signs in his life, water fountains that he couldn't drink out of, and places he couldn't go. He was then drafted into the Marines, and he was part of the first group of Black Marines in World War II, and he prepared for the invasion of Japan, which obviously the alternative happened, but would have been sure death for my father. A very hardworking man. It was a time of great segregation and pain, and not a place that I would have expected anyone to enjoy living in, quite honestly. But we moved to the South Bronx. And again, as Kirsty said, I'm not sure that was a step up. In the 60s and 70s, the South Bronx was the murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and arson capital of the world. 40% of the South Bronx was burned or abandoned. I had hardworking parents, and we were able to move to the suburbs. We were the first Black family in a part of Queens, a suburb of New York City. There were 32 houses in our neighborhood that were all white. In 2 years, the whole neighborhood was black. I went to night school and worked during the day because we couldn't afford college tuition. In some ways, that was my apprenticeship, and that 80% of my time was at work and 20% of my time was at night, coupled with a 2-hour commute back home. And then, as Kirsty said, I was lucky to be on the board of the CIP and City Guilds. Fast forward, I moved to the UK approximately 17 years ago, and a strange statistic I carry with me to this day. In the FTSE 250, the biggest 250 companies in the world, the most senior level job for HR professional in the FTSE 250 is that of a group HR director. They typically sit on the management board. In the history of the FTSE 250, there have only been 2 black male group HR directors in the history of the FTSE 250, only 2 black male group HR directors. Humbly, I was both. That does not speak to me. That speaks to a bigger issue in the profession and the country about the progression and opportunities afforded blacks within the system. I left the corporate world approximately 8 years ago to start my own consulting firm, and there has not been a black group HR director of any gender.